He built an empire on blood, silence, and deals written in rooms where the wrong answer got you buried. No one walked away from Damien Volkov. No one even tried. Until she did. The night he showed up at her door, he wasn't looking for a fight. He wasn't looking for anything. Or so he told himself. But when that door swung open and he saw a one-way plane ticket sitting on her kitchen table, something cracked open inside his chest that 20 years of ruthless discipline had never prepared him for. She was already gone. She just hadn't left yet. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it hits you the way I think it will, stay until the end. The city never fully slept. Not this city. Not the kind of city built on commerce that didn't appear in any official ledger, where the skyline looked clean from a distance but reeked of copper and favors up close. Harwick wasn't the worst place in the world. It was just honest about what it was. A machine, grinding forward, indifferent to whoever fed it. Damien Volkov had fed it well. He sat behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 43rd floor, his back to the room, his eyes on the grid of lights below. It was past 11. The bourbon in his glass had been untouched for 40 minutes. Not because he didn't want it, because somewhere between the third meeting of the day and the fourth, he had stopped being able to feel the taste of things. That happened sometimes. He didn't examine it. The Ashcroft family confirmed the rehearsal dinner venue, said the voice behind him. Calm. Measured. The voice of someone who had learned over years how to deliver information without coloring it. Saturday. The Hartwell estate. Vivian's people want the seating arrangement finalized by Thursday morning. Fine. You haven't looked at the draft. I said fine, Nia. A pause. Not a wounded pause. Not the kind that filled with resentment. Just a pause that absorbed the dismissal the way good leather absorbed rain. Without protest, without damage. That was one of the things about Nia Okoro that Damien had come to rely on so completely he had stopped noticing it. The way you stop noticing the floor beneath your feet. She didn't buckle. She didn't push. She simply held her ground without making it a confrontation. The Marchetti account also needs a signature before 8 tomorrow, she said. And your brother called? Twice. I told him you were in meetings. Was I? You were staring out a window, but the distinction seemed unnecessary. He almost smiled. Almost. Anything else? That's everything for tonight. He heard the soft sound of her tablet being tucked under her arm. The small, efficient sounds of a woman wrapping up her day. I'll have the seating draft on your desk before 7. Nia, she stopped. You've been here since 6 this morning. I'm aware. That's 17 hours. The Marchetti timeline didn't care about the hour, and neither did the Ashcroft coordinator. A beat. I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Volkov. And then she was gone. He turned from the window. The office felt larger without her in it. That was something he would not have been able to articulate 3 years ago, maybe not even 1 year ago. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't locate or name, the square footage seemed to expand the moment the door clicked shut behind her. He picked up his bourbon. Drank. It tasted like nothing. Nia Okoro did not take taxis home. She never had. Not out of frugality. The salary Damien paid her was generous enough that taxis would have been trivial. But out of habit, out of the deep-rooted understanding that the 20-minute walk between the Volkov building and her apartment on Crestfield Avenue was the only time in a given day that belonged entirely to her. She moved through the night with her coat pulled close and her earbuds in, but no music playing. She just needed the world muffled. Her own thoughts were loud enough. Thursday. She had until Thursday before she absolutely had to tell him. She had rehearsed it 40 different ways. Short, professional. No room for discussion. Mr. Volkov, I've accepted a position in Geneva. My last day will be the 14th. I've prepared transition documents. Clean, surgical. The way he preferred all difficult news delivered. The problem wasn't the words. She had the words. The problem was the 14 seconds after the words, when he would look at her in that particular way he had. Not angry, not surprised, just calculating, measuring, deciding how the information fit into the larger architecture of his world. And she would have to stand there and not look away, and not apologize, and not take it back. She'd spent 6 years in his orbit. 6 years learning the particular language of a man who trusted no one and needed everyone. 6 years watching him move through rooms like weather, rearranging everything around him without ever being rearranged himself. She was 31 years old, and she had built a life that belonged almost entirely to someone else's empire. Geneva was supposed to fix that. She turned onto Crestfield, climbed the 4 flights to her apartment, and pushed open the door. The place was small by any objective measure. 1 bedroom, a kitchen that doubled as a dining room, walls covered in the accumulated evidence of a life she'd kept deliberately private. Framed photographs of her mother and younger sister. Stacks of novels she'd actually read. A corkboard above the desk where she pinned handwritten notes and postcards she'd collected over years but never managed to send. The plane ticket sat on the kitchen table. She had printed it that morning. One way, Harwich to Geneva. Departure in 9 days. She picked it up, held it, felt the weight of it, which was nothing, a few grams of paper, and also everything. 9 days. She set it back down, filled a glass with water, and leaned against the counter. Through the single window above the sink, the city hummed and pulsed and ignored her entirely, which was exactly what she needed right now. To be ignored, to be anonymous, to be, for just a few hours, nobody's assistant and nobody's anchor. She was halfway through her water when someone knocked on her door. She didn't check the peephole. That was the first mistake. She was tired, her guard was down, and nobody knocked on her door at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, except her neighbor, Mrs. Parrish, when the smoke alarm battery died again. She opened the door. Damian Volkov stood in her hallway. He was still in his work clothes, slate gray suit, open collar, no tie. He looked exactly as he always looked, which was to say he looked like a man constructed for the sole purpose of occupying space more completely than anyone else in the room. 6'2", broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and now was something harder and more permanent than handsome. He was 44 years old, and he looked like someone had carved him out of material that didn't soften with age. He was also staring past her shoulder at the kitchen table, at the plane ticket. The silence stretched out like a wire pulled too tight. Mr. Volkov, her voice came out level. She was proud of that. This is unexpected. His eyes moved from the ticket to her face. Something shifted in his expression. Not much, barely a flicker, but she had spent 6 years learning the microgeography of this man's face, and she caught it. The Marchetti contract has a clause on page 47 that your revised version removes, he said. I need to understand why before I sign anything. It was not why he was here. They both knew it. Page 47. She stepped back, pulling the door wider, an invitation she wasn't sure she meant to extend. Come in. He came in. He filled her apartment the way he filled every space. Not aggressively, but completely, as if the room reorganized itself around him by instinct. She watched him take in the walls, the books, the corkboard, the photographs. She watched him look at all of it with the careful, contained attention of a man cataloging something he hadn't expected to find. She moved to the kitchen table and deliberately placed her hand over the plane ticket, not hiding it, just covering it. A gesture she regretted immediately because it drew his eye directly to her hand and what was beneath it. Page 47, she said again. The clause you're referring to is the arbitration language. I removed it because it exposed the organization to third-party jurisdiction in a dispute with Marchetti. Your original legal team missed it. I flagged it in the revision notes. He wasn't looking at the contract notes. He wasn't looking at anything in the room except her hand, flat against the kitchen table. How long? He said. The question landed like something thrown. I beg your pardon? How long have you been planning to leave? The room got very quiet. The city outside kept humming. Nia removed her hand from the ticket and stood up straight. I submitted my formal resignation 2 days ago to HR, she said. I intended to speak with you directly on Thursday. That was always the plan. 2 days. He said it without inflection. That was somehow worse than if he'd said it with anger. You submitted your resignation 2 days ago, and I'm finding out because I drove to your apartment at midnight about a contract clause I could have emailed you about. She didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer that served any purpose. He picked up the ticket. She made herself not react. He looked at it the way he looked at contracts, completely, thoroughly, taking in every piece of information it contained. The date, the destination, the word one way printed in small caps at the top corner. He set it back down. Geneva, he said. Yes. You speak French. I speak 4 languages. You knew that when you hired me.
I knew it, and I didn't think about what it meant. He turned away from the table and looked at the corkboard above her desk. The postcards, the handwritten notes. A photograph of a younger Nia standing with a woman who shared her eyes and her cheekbones. Her mother, he somehow understood without being told. What's in Geneva?
A position with an international trade firm. Legitimate. Senior analyst role. She crossed her arms. Not defensively, just to have something to do with them. It's a good opportunity. I've earned it. I'm not arguing that. You're standing in my apartment at midnight. He turned back to face her. Yes. That's an argument. He was quiet for a moment, one of his long architectural silences that she'd spent years learning not to fill with nervous speech. She held her ground and waited. You fixed the Marchetti clause, he said finally. Yes. You caught the jurisdictional exposure my own legal team missed. Yes. You've been doing that for 6 years. He said it without warmth and without coldness, just stating a fact the way he stated all facts. Catching things, fixing things, staying late, holding the pieces together while I was in the room, everyone was watching. That was my job. It was more than your job, and you know it. She felt something tighten behind her sternum. She kept her face still. What exactly are you here for, Mr. Volkov? Because if it's to make a counteroffer, I'd ask you to respect my decision and save us both the, I'm not here to make a counteroffer. Then what? He looked at her. Just looked at her. And for one fractured, unguarded moment, Damian Volkov looked like a man who had just realized he was standing at the edge of something enormous and had arrived there without a map. I don't know, he said. It was, in 6 years, the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. She didn't know what to do with it. She wasn't sure he did either. The city hummed outside the window. The ticket sat on the table between them, 9 days of departure folded into a few grams of paper. Somewhere in the building below, a door slammed. A car horn flared and faded. Nia Okoro looked at the most dangerous man she had ever known, standing in the middle of her small, warm, carefully constructed life, and felt for the first time in 6 years completely unprepared. He left 20 minutes later. They talked about the contract. She walked him through page 47, point by point, the way she had walked him through 1,000 documents over 1,000 late nights. He listened. He asked 2 sharp, precise questions. She answered them. At no point did either of them acknowledge what had actually happened in that apartment. She locked the door behind him and stood with her back against it and listened to the sound of the elevator at the end of the hall. She waited until she heard the mechanical groan of its descent. Then she walked to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and sat down at the table across from the plane ticket. 9 days. Except now the 9 days felt different. Now they felt like a wire pulled tight in a new direction, and she couldn't entirely tell whether the pressure was coming from Geneva pulling her forward or from something in the city she hadn't finished walking away from yet. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that twice. It didn't take. 3 miles across the city, Damian Volkov sat in the back of his car and did not tell his driver where to go. The car idled at the curb outside her building for 4 minutes before he finally said home and felt the vehicle begin to move. He stared at his phone. He had a resignation letter pulled up, forwarded to him by HR the moment he'd demanded it, 2 hours ago, when the words Nia Okoro and voluntary termination had appeared in the same sentence, and something in his chest had done something he had no clinical language for. Dear Mr. Volkov, please accept this letter as formal notification of my resignation, effective the 14th. He closed it. He thought about the corkboard above her desk, the postcards, the photograph of her mother, the stack of novels with cracked spines that told him she actually read them rather than displayed them. He thought about the way her apartment had smelled, coffee and paper and something quieter underneath, something that wasn't a product or a performance. He thought about a one-way ticket and a woman who had spent 6 years holding his world together and had decided, quietly, without drama, without asking for anything, that it was time to go build her own. He thought about the fact that she had never, in 6 years, asked him for a single thing. Not one thing. He pressed his thumb against the side window. The glass was cold. He was getting married in 3 weeks. The Ashcroft Alliance, 20 years of groundwork, a merger that would consolidate 2 of the most powerful criminal networks on the eastern seaboard under a single political umbrella. Vivian Ashcroft was intelligent, composed, and had understood from the beginning that their engagement was a transaction. She had asked for honesty, and he had given it. She had asked for respect, and he had given that too. What she had never asked for, what neither of them had ever pretended was part of the arrangement, was love. The car moved through the city. The lights slid past the window. Damian Volkov sat very still and did something he almost never did. He thought about what he actually wanted. The answer arrived before he was ready for it. It arrived with a clarity that felt, to a man who had built his entire existence on controlling outcomes, absolutely terrifying. By the time the car reached his building, he had already made a decision that was going to detonate everything he had spent 20 years constructing. He just didn't know yet how many people it was going to bury. The wedding was canceled at 7:43 in the morning, not in a room full of people, not with lawyers present or families assembled or any of the ceremony that a decision of that magnitude deserved. It happened in a single phone call, 4 minutes long, in the back of Damian Volkov's car while his driver pretended to be deaf, and the city outside moved through its ordinary morning with complete indifference. Vivian Ashcroft picked up on the second ring. "Damian, I need to cancel the wedding." A silence, not shocked, not devastated, something more precise than either of those things. The silence of a woman who was very intelligent, absorbing information she had not expected and deciding in real time how to respond to it. "When you say cancel," she said finally, "you mean postpone?" "No." Another silence, longer. "I see." Her voice was perfectly controlled. That was the thing about Vivian. She had been raised in the same world he had, trained from childhood to keep her face still and her voice flat when the ground moved beneath her. "Is this about the Marchetti complication? Because Father's people have already—" "It's not about Marchetti." "Then what is it about?" He watched a traffic light change outside the window, red to green. The car moved forward. "I'm not going to insult you with an explanation that isn't the full truth," he said, "and I'm not ready to give you the full truth yet. What I can tell you is that this is my decision, my failure, and I'll manage the fallout with both families personally." The silence this time was different, thinner, like something stretched until it was almost transparent. "Damian." Her voice had dropped half a register, still controlled, but something underneath it now, something that wasn't anger and wasn't grief, but was its own specific kind of wound. "We had an arrangement, a clear one. I kept my end of it." "You did. Everything about this is on me." "That's not a comfort." "It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be accurate." He heard her exhale. A long, slow breath, the kind that cost something to take. "My father is going to want answers." "I know. He's not going to accept I'm not ready to explain." "I know that too. I'll call him directly, this afternoon." "And what do I tell people?" Her voice tightened slightly at the edges, the first crack in the finish. "What do I say when they ask me what happened?" "Tell them it was mutual." He paused. "Or tell them the truth. That I ended it without a satisfying reason. Either way, you owe these people nothing, Vivian. You never did." The line went quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had settled into something he didn't entirely recognize. Not coldness, but a kind of exhausted clarity. "I hope she's worth it," Vivian said. The call ended before he could respond. He sat with the dead phone in his hand and the morning moving past the window and the weight of what he'd just done sitting on his chest like something architectural. 20 years of groundwork, 2 families, an alliance that had been referenced in closed-room conversations as the consolidation that would reshape the Eastern network for a generation. Gone in 4 minutes. He told himself he didn't feel the size of it. He was a remarkably poor liar, even to himself. Maya found out at 9:15 from Marcus Webb. Marcus was Damian's head of external relations, the man responsible for managing the public-facing version of the Volkov organization's various legitimate business interests. He was 52 years old, a former corporate attorney, and he had a habit of delivering terrible news with the cheerful efficiency of someone reading a grocery list. He appeared in Nia's office doorway with a coffee in one hand and a look on his face that she had come to recognize as his "something has exploded and I need your help containing it" expression. "Tell me you knew about this," he said. She looked up from her screen. "Knew about what?" He stared at her. "The wedding. He called it off this morning." The words took a moment to arrange themselves into meaning. "He
called Vivian Ashcroft at 7:43 and canceled the entire thing. No explanation, no prior discussion with legal, with family liaison, with anyone. Marcus came fully into the office and closed the door behind him, which was never a good sign. Do you have any idea what the Ashcroft organization is going to do with this? Gerald Ashcroft has people. He has reach. He is going to interpret this as a deliberate... Stop. Nia held up a hand. Her voice was steady. Her chest was not. Where is he now? In his office. He told Carla to hold all calls, which means either he's already in damage control mode or he's sitting in there staring at a wall, neither of which tells me what I'm supposed to say when Gerald Ashcroft's people call in. Marcus checked his watch. Approximately 40 minutes, which is how long it will take the news to move from Vivian to her father's inner circle.
Nia was already standing. She picked up her tablet and her coffee and moved for the door. Nia. Marcus caught her with the word, not his hand. She stopped. Do you know why he did it? She didn't answer that. She walked down the hall to Damien's office, knocked once, and opened the door without waiting.
He was standing at the window. Of course he was. It was his natural habitat, glass and distance, and the city spread out below like a map of everything he controlled. He turned when the door opened, and his face was the careful, composed face he wore for boardrooms and difficult conversations, which told her absolutely nothing about what was happening underneath it. I didn't call for you, he said. No. She closed the door. You canceled your wedding this morning. I did. Without telling legal, without telling family liaison, without giving Gerald Ashcroft any warning or, I'm aware of what I didn't do. Then you understand that in approximately 35 minutes, this office is going to be fielding calls from people who are angry in ways that have historically resulted in, I'll handle Gerald, Damien. She used his name, not Mr. Volkov. His name. She only did it when the situation had moved past the kind of professional distance that titles maintained, and they both registered the shift. What happened? He looked at her. Just directly looked at her. The way he had looked at her in her apartment the night before. That uncharacteristic, unguarded quality in his eyes that she didn't have a category for. I made a decision, he said. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. She pressed her back teeth together, breathed through her nose. 6 years of managing this man's crises had given her a very specific kind of patience. The kind that was not passive, not gentle, but tactical. She used it now. The Ashcroft Alliance took 20 years to construct, she said, keeping her voice flat and precise. Gerald Ashcroft has 3 sitting judges and a federal prosecutor in his network. If he decides to interpret this as an insult, and he will, because it is, then the exposure to this organization is, I know what the exposure is. Do you? Because you made a 4-minute phone call this morning that has the potential to undo more than 2 decades of Nia. His voice cut across hers. Not loud, just final. The voice he used when the conversation was over, when the decision was made, when the room needed to understand that further argument was a waste of everyone's time. She'd heard it 100 times. She hated it every single time. I made a decision. It is made. I need you to help me manage what comes next, not relitigate what I can't undo. She stared at him. He stared back. The window behind him flooded the room with gray morning light. Fine, she said. Then here's what comes next. You need to call Gerald Ashcroft personally before his people call us. You need to offer him something, not an explanation, not an apology, but something concrete that tells him this doesn't alter his organization's position in the network. And you need to do it in the next 20 minutes before the story moves beyond the family and becomes something that requires a different kind of management entirely. He nodded once. Set up the call. I'll need to know what you're willing to offer him. The Bellport contracts. All 3. Exclusively to Ashcroft's subsidiaries for the next 18 months. She didn't blink. That's significant. It should be. He's still going to want to know why. He can want whatever he likes. Damien turned back to the window. Make the call, Nia. She left. She walked back down the hall with her tablet under her arm and the coffee she hadn't touched going cold in her hand and the feeling in her chest of something very large moving in a direction she didn't understand and could not at this particular moment afford to examine. She had 9 days until her flight. She sat down at her desk and started making calls.
Gerald Ashcroft said 17 words before Damien cut him off. Those 17 words were not words that men in their position said to each other in the ordinary course of business. They were words that came out of a different register entirely, the older, rawer vocabulary of men who had been building things for decades and understood, in their bones, what it meant when those things were dismantled. Damien let him get through all 17 before he spoke. Gerald, the Bellport contracts, all 3. Exclusively to your subsidiaries, 18 months guaranteed in writing by end of week. Silence. That doesn't explain. No, it doesn't. And I'm not going to explain. What I'm going to do is make sure that your organization doesn't lose a single dollar or a single position because of a decision I made for personal reasons. That's what I can offer you. If it's not enough, tell me now, and we'll find something that is. Another silence. Longer. Gerald Ashcroft was 71 years old and had survived 4 federal investigations and 2 attempts on his life, and he had not done any of that by being stupid. Personal reasons, Gerald said slowly. Yes. Does my daughter know what the personal reasons are? She has a better sense of it than you do right now. A sound that might have been a bitter laugh, or something that was in the same zip code as a bitter laugh, without quite getting there. You know what I told Vivian when this engagement was announced? I told her that Damien Volkov was many things, but he was never careless. I told her that whatever else the arrangement was, it was solid. That a man like you didn't make moves without understanding what they cost. I understood. And you made the move anyway. Yes. The line was quiet for a long moment. When Gerald spoke again, his voice had changed. The anger was still there, but underneath it was something almost like curiosity. The reluctant curiosity of a man who recognized something he didn't entirely expect. The Bellport contracts, Gerald said. In writing. End of week. In writing. End of week. We're not done talking about this. I know. The call ended. Damien set his phone on the desk and leaned back in his chair and pressed his palms flat against the surface and breathed for a moment. Just breathed. The room was quiet. Through the closed door, he could hear the muffled sounds of the office moving around him. Phones, footsteps, the low hum of a building running on controlled tension. He had bought himself time, not forgiveness, not resolution, just time, which was the most you could usually purchase and frequently the most useful thing anyway. His intercom clicked. Carla's voice. Mr. Volkov, Ms. Socorro says the documentation for the Bellport transfer needs your sign-off before she can initiate the paperwork. Send her in. Nia came in with a folder and a pen and the expression of someone who was doing a job with extreme precision because the alternative was to feel something she'd decided not to feel right now. He recognized it because he had worn that expression for most of his adult life. She laid the folder on his desk. Signature on pages 3, 7, and 12. He opened it, found page 3. You drafted this in 40 minutes, he said. I had a template. From what occasion? From the last time you made a large-scale financial concession to prevent a partnership from collapsing. She paused. March, 4 years ago. The Renner situation. He looked up at her. You kept the template. I keep everything. She said it without emphasis, like it was nothing, like the fact that she had spent 6 years quietly archiving every crisis he'd ever created against the possibility of future use was just a minor administrative habit. He looked back at the folder and signed page 3. Nia. Page 7 is next. I know where page 7 is. He didn't look up. I need you to know that what I did this morning is not something I'm in a position to discuss in a professional context. We're past professional context. We're not. Her voice was very even. We are in your office during business hours, managing a crisis you created. We are entirely within professional context. Page 7. He turned to page 7, signed it, turned to page 12. When did you plan to tell me? He said. Thursday. I already told you that. I mean before that. Before the resignation letter. Before the plane ticket. He signed page 12 and closed the folder and looked at her directly. Was there a version of this where you told me you were thinking about leaving? Where we had a conversation before you had already decided? Something moved through her expression, brief, controlled, gone before he could fully read it. No, she said. Why not?
because it wasn't your decision to make. I'm not saying it was. I'm asking why there was no conversation. She picked up the folder from his desk, tucked it under her arm. And for a moment she just stood there, and he watched her find the words for something she had clearly never intended to say out loud. Because every time I've imagined having that conversation, she said quietly, I imagined you fixing it, offering something, restructuring the role, increasing the compensation, making an argument I wouldn't have an answer to. And I knew that if you made that argument, I might stay. And if I stayed, I'd spend another 6 years building something that belongs to you and losing track of everything that's supposed to belong to me. She met his eyes. So I didn't give you the chance to make the argument. The room was very quiet. That's not a flattering picture of me, he said. No, she agreed. But it's an accurate one. She left with the folder and the signed pages and left him sitting in the silence she'd created, which was the most uncomfortable kind of silence. The kind that told you something true about yourself that you hadn't previously admitted. By 3 o'clock, the office had fractured along invisible fault lines. Word traveled the way it always traveled in closed organizations. Not through official channels, but through the lateral networks of assistants and mid-level managers and people who ate lunch together and noticed things. By noon, everyone who mattered knew the wedding was off. By 2, the question of why had split into at least 3 competing theories, none of which were accurate, all of which contained a grain of something that felt like the truth. Marcus Webb called an informal meeting in the second-floor conference room. Just the senior staff. Just the people who needed to understand what the day's events meant for their individual territories. Nia attended because it was her job to attend. She sat at the far end of the table and said very little and watched the room with the particular stillness she'd cultivated over years of being the person in the room that no one fully looked at. That was the thing about being an executive assistant to a man like Damian Volkov. You became functionally invisible, not because you were insignificant. Everyone in that room understood that Nia Okoro was the organizational spine of the entire operation, but because you occupied a supporting role in a world that only noticed supporting roles when they failed. She had not failed. She had simply decided she was finished. Across the table, a man named Conrad Hale was speaking. He was the organization's senior financial officer, 60s, silver-haired, the kind of smooth that took decades of practice. She had always found him faintly unpleasant in the way of very capable men who knew how to appear trustworthy. The Bellport concession is significant, Conrad was saying. It's a clean way to manage the Ashcroft response, but it creates a gap in our Eastern distribution network that someone is going to need to fill by Q2. Damian's already aware of the gap, Marcus said. He'll address it. I'm sure he will. I'm simply noting that this morning's decision has financial implications that extend beyond the personal. Conrad's eyes moved briefly around the table, pausing for just a fraction of a second on Nia before moving on. Decisions of this magnitude typically benefit from broader consultation. Noted, Marcus said, in the tone of a man filing something directly into a drawer he would never open. Nia watched Conrad Hale and felt, somewhere in the back of her mind, a small and specific unease that she couldn't immediately source. Something about the way his eyes had moved. Something about the way he'd said financial implications with a particular weight, as if the phrase was a door and he was deciding whether to open it. She filed it, moved on. She had 8 days left, a stack of transition documents to complete, and a departure that was becoming increasingly complicated by forces she had not anticipated. She did not have the bandwidth to chase peripheral instincts about Conrad Hale. She would spend the next 72 hours regretting that. The message came at 11:40 that night. She was at her kitchen table, the same ticket, same apartment, going through the transition protocol documents she'd been building for the past 3 weeks. The systematic, organized handover of 6 years of institutional knowledge, indexed and cross-referenced and formatted for whoever would step into her role and try to make sense of the shape she'd left in the organization. Her work phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost ignored it. She didn't. The message contained no introduction and no signature. Just a file attachment, 3 words, and a single question. Check the accounts. November through March. Ask yourself who benefits when no one's looking. She stared at the screen for a long moment. Then she opened the attachment. It was a financial document, or rather, it was a fragment of one, a section of an internal ledger that she recognized the formatting of,
Because she had spent 6 years cross-referencing documents in this exact structure. Shell company disbursements. Sequential transfers, each one small enough to fall below automatic review thresholds. Dozens of them, spread across 5 months, each routing through a different subsidiary before landing in an account she didn't recognize. She scrolled. Her fingers were very steady. Her heart was doing something loud and irregular that she was choosing to ignore. The total, across all the transfers she could see in this single fragment, was $4.3 million. She put her phone face down on the table, stared at the wall, thought about the 42 days remaining on her transition timeline, thought about the one-way ticket, thought about Geneva and the job that was waiting for her, and the life she had constructed in her imagination as an alternative to the one she was currently sitting inside. She thought about Conrad Hale's eyes moving across the conference table this afternoon, pausing on her face for one fraction of a second too long. She picked her phone back up. She opened her secure laptop and pulled up the organization's full financial archive, which she had access to because she had access to everything, because that was the nature of her role. Because Damien trusted her with everything except the things he didn't know he should be protecting. She opened the archive at 11:47 at night, and she did not close it until 4:22 in the morning. By the time the first gray light began pushing through the window above her sink, Nia Okoro had not slept, had not eaten, had finished the cold remains of 2 cups of coffee she barely remembered making, and had assembled across 14 separate documents spread between her laptop screen and 3 legal pads covered in her own handwriting. A picture so complete and so devastating that she sat with it for a long time before she could make herself look at it directly. 4.3 million was not the number. The number was 11.8. $11,840,000 moved in careful increments over the course of 7 months through a layered architecture of shell companies, dormant subsidiaries, and falsified vendor accounts that had been constructed with a precision that told her 2 things immediately. First, whoever had built this structure knew the organization's internal audit protocols intimately enough to design around every automatic flag. Second, they had been planning it for a very long time. She sat back in her chair. The legal pads were covered in her handwriting. Account numbers, transfer dates, subsidiary names, the flow of money mapped in blue ink across yellow paper like the anatomy of something diseased. She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum and breathed. Conrad Hale. She had 3 layers of documentation connecting him to the shell architecture. Not his name. His name appeared nowhere in anything, which was itself a kind of signature, the deliberate absence of a man who knew exactly which surfaces to avoid touching. But the structure of the transfers, the timing of them relative to Conrad's documented travel schedule, the vendor accounts that traced back through 2 layers of intermediary to a property registered to a holding company whose registered agent shared an address with Conrad's personal attorney, it was not a confession. It was not the kind of evidence that ended careers in courtrooms. It was the kind of evidence that ended careers in rooms where the people making decisions didn't need courtrooms. She looked at the plane ticket on the corner of her table. She had moved it there at some point during the night, pushed to the edge to make room for the legal pads. It sat at a slight angle, its corner hanging over the table's edge, 9 days of departure waiting patiently to be acknowledged. She thought about Geneva for approximately 4 seconds. Then she picked up her work phone and began documenting everything in a format she could present. She called Damien at 6:15 in the morning. He picked up on the first ring, which told her he hadn't slept either, though she did not examine what that meant. "I need to see you," she said. "Not the office, not by phone, in person, this morning, somewhere that isn't either of our buildings." A pause. Short. "What happened?" "I'll explain when I see you." "Nia, it's not something I'm going to say on a phone line." She kept her voice level. "I need 2 hours of your unscheduled time and a room with a door. Can you do that?" Another pause. Longer. She heard him breathing and then heard the specific quality of silence that meant he was making a calculation. "The Aldrin Club," he said. "Private dining room, 7:30. I'll be there." She ended the call, gathered her legal pads, photographed every page, encrypted the files, and sent them to a personal server she maintained for exactly this kind of situation, the kind she had always hoped would never arise. She printed a clean summary document on her home printer, 12 pages.
She put it in a folder and put the folder in her bag. She looked at the plane ticket. She left it on the table and walked out the door.
The Aldrin Club was the kind of establishment that didn't advertise its existence. No sign above the door. No listing in any directory. You either knew where it was and had the standing to walk in, or you didn't exist to it in any meaningful sense. Damien had been a member since he was 31, and in all the years she had managed his calendar, Nia had never been inside it. It looked from the inside like a place where important decisions had been made for a very long time. Dark wood. Leather. The particular hush of rooms that absorbed sound by design. A young man in a dark jacket led her to the private dining room at the back without asking her name, which meant Damien had arranged it in advance, which meant he had taken her call seriously enough to move immediately. He was already there when she arrived, jacket on, coffee in front of him, the composed exterior fully assembled. But he stood when she came in, which he didn't usually do, which was a small thing and not a small thing simultaneously, and waited until the door was closed before he spoke. "Talk to me," he said. She sat across from him and opened the folder and put the 12 pages on the table between them and didn't preface any of it with context or cushion. She walked him through it the way she would walk him through any analysis, point by point, documented, sequential. Account numbers, transfer dates, the shell architecture, the vendor account connections, the registered agent's shared address. She talked for 18 minutes without stopping, and he listened without interrupting, which was not something Damien Volkov did for most people, and which she registered without remarking on. When she finished, the room was quiet. He picked up the last page of the summary. Read it again. His jaw was very tight. She could see the muscle working at the corner of it, the single physical tell that meant something was happening beneath the composed surface that the surface was working hard to contain. "Conrad," he said. "The documentation doesn't carry his name directly, but the architecture, I know what the architecture means." He set the page down. "How long have you been looking at this?" "Since 11:40 last night." His eyes moved to her face, took in, she assumed, the absence of sleep, the flatness of exhaustion, the particular quality of alertness that came from running on adrenaline past the point where the body had anything reasonable to offer. "Someone sent you the initial document," he said. "Yes." "Who?" "Unknown number." "I don't know. I haven't tried to trace it yet." She paused. "My working assumption is that someone inside the organization knows about the theft and is afraid to bring it to you directly. Or someone inside the organization wants me to find it in a way that creates maximum damage to Conrad specifically." She hadn't dismissed that possibility. "Yes, that's also possible. Which means before I move on any of this, I need to know which scenario I'm in." Agreed. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him think, the specific, visible quality of his thinking, which looked like stillness from the outside, but which she'd learned over years was actually the opposite. He was moving very fast inside that stillness, calculating, mapping, building the structure of a response with the same architectural precision that Conrad Hale had apparently used to build the structure of a theft. "You were going to leave in 9 days, he said. "I'm aware. This investigation, if it goes where the documentation suggests it goes, is not a 9-day problem." She said nothing. She had arrived at the same conclusion at approximately 3 in the morning and had spent the subsequent hour and 20 minutes deciding how she felt about it. "I'm not asking you to stay," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm simply stating a fact about the timeline." "You're stating a fact that is functionally a request." "No, it's a fact. What you do with it is your decision." She looked at him. He looked back. The 12 pages sat between them on the table like a problem that had no clean solution, which was an accurate description of what they were. "I'll finish the investigation," she said. "I'll give you everything I have, fully documented, presented in a way that protects the organization's ability to act on it. What happens after that is yours to manage." "And Geneva?" "Geneva will wait or Geneva won't." She closed the folder. "Right now, this is what's in front of me." Something moved through his expression that, brief, almost imperceptible. Something that was not relief and not gratitude, but was in the territory adjacent to both. "Thank you," he said. It was the second time in her experience of him that he had said those words and meant them in a register that was not professional. She acknowledged it with a nod and said nothing further, because there was nothing further to say that wouldn't cost more than either of them had budgeted for this morning. Conrad Hale arrived at the office at his usual time, 8:45, with his usual coffee and his usual composed silver-haired authority, and he spent the first 3 hours of the day doing exactly what he always did: managing numbers, running meetings, presenting himself as the indispensable financial intelligence of an organization that had trusted him completely for 11 years. Nia watched him from a distance for all 3 of those hours. She was careful about it. She had learned careful from the best, which was to say she had learned it from Damien, who had built an entire operational philosophy around the principle that the most dangerous thing you could do was let someone know you were looking at them before you were ready to move. She went about her day with the systematic efficiency that everyone expected from her. She answered emails. She managed the Bellport documentation. She attended a briefing on the Eastern Network restructuring and said exactly as much as she always said, which was enough to be useful and never enough to be memorable. She was building something. She needed more time to build it properly. By noon, she had accessed 3 additional archive layers and found 2 more shell accounts she hadn't identified the night before. By 2, she had a clearer picture of the full transfer mechanism, the way money moved from the organization's operating accounts through a legitimate-looking vendor relationship into a subsidiary, then out again through 3 sequential transfers into an account in an offshore jurisdiction that had the regulatory transparency of a black hole. By 3:15, she found the account name. She sat very still when she found it. Her hands were flat on the keyboard. The screen in front of her was exactly as it had been 1 second before she found it. Nothing had changed about the fluorescent light or the hum of the building or the sound of phones in the hallway outside. But something had changed in the quality of the air in her chest, as if the room had decided to hold its breath along with her. The account wasn't in Conrad Hale's name. It was in the name of a holding company called Meridian Bridge Consulting, which Nia had seen before. She had seen it exactly once, 11 months ago, in a contract addendum she had processed without particular attention because it had appeared to be a routine vendor agreement for advisory services. A contract she had processed. A contract that bore, among other signatures, her own initials on the intake documentation, which was standard practice and meant nothing in isolation and meant something terrible in the context of what she was now looking at. Someone had put her name adjacent to the money. Not directly, not provably, but adjacently, in the careful, deniable way of someone who understood exactly how institutional accountability worked and had decided, at some point in the preceding 11 months, to leave a thread that could be pulled in a particular direction if it ever became necessary to pull it. She understood immediately what she was looking at. This wasn't just theft. This was a construction. A deliberate, patient, professionally executed frame built by someone who had identified her as the most useful person to be standing near the evidence when the evidence was eventually found. Someone who had known, or suspected, or been informed that Nia Okoro was preparing to leave, and had decided to move their timeline accordingly, to complete the transfer architecture before she disappeared, while her initials were still on current documentation, while she was still present and available to absorb whatever fell. She sat with that for 60 seconds, counted them, let the shape of it settle into something she could look at without flinching. Then she picked up her phone and called Damien. "I need you to come to my office," she said. "Now. And I need you to make sure Conrad Hale doesn't leave the building before you do." Damien moved fast when he moved. That was one of the things about him. The stillness was a waiting state, not a permanent one, and when the stillness ended, the transition was immediate and total. By the time he appeared in her office doorway 4 minutes later, he had already communicated something to someone because she heard, from down the hall, the particular quality of organizational movement that meant access points were being quietly managed. She showed him the Meridian Bridge account, showed him the contract addendum, showed him her initials on the intake form, and the date, and the transfer timeline relative to that date. She watched his face as he understood what she was showing him. She had seen Damien Volkov angry before. She had seen him coldly furious, calculatingly enraged, the kind of controlled dangerous that made rooms go quiet by instinct. She had never seen what happened to his face in the 15 seconds after he fully absorbed what the Meridian Bridge account meant. It was not anger. It was something older and more fundamental than anger. The specific expression of a man who has just understood that someone he trusted has spent the better part of a year building a trap with his closest colleague as the intended casualty. "He was going to let it land on you," Damien said.
His voice was very quiet. When I left, yes, I think the plan was to surface the discrepancy after my departure. Missing funds. My initials on the intake document. A former employee who had abruptly resigned and was no longer available to defend herself. She met his eyes. It would have taken time to unravel, if it could be unraveled at all. In the meantime, the organization would have had a story that explained the missing money without requiring anyone currently present to answer for it. And you found it before you left. Someone made sure I would. The anonymous message. Yes. He was very still. The kind of still that she now understood was not calm. Where is Conrad? He said. Not a question. Third floor conference room. He has a 2 o'clock that's running long. Damien moved toward the door. Damien. She said it sharply enough that he stopped. He turned. If you go in there without a strategy, he'll lawyer up in 30 seconds and you'll have nothing. The documentation I have is substantial, but it's not complete. I need 48 more hours to close the architecture, to find the account where the money is currently sitting and connect it to him directly in a way that has no ambiguity. He looked at her. Every muscle in his body was pointed toward the conference room down the hall. She could see it, the physical cost of what she was asking, which was for a man who operated on instinct and force to hold both of those things in check for 48 hours, while the person who had tried to destroy her continued to walk through his building with a cup of coffee and a clean conscience. 48 hours, he said. 48 hours. He doesn't leave the city. Agreed, but nothing that spooks him. If he runs, the money disappears and we lose the thread. Damien said nothing for a long moment. His jaw was tight. The muscle was working. She watched him construct the discipline required to do the strategic thing instead of the immediate thing, and she understood in that moment something about him that she hadn't previously been able to articulate, that the control he exercised was not natural to him, had never been natural to him, but was something he had built over decades out of the understanding that the alternative cost more than he could afford. 48 hours, he said again. A different inflection this time. Not a question or a negotiation. A commitment. I'll have everything by Thursday morning. He nodded once and left the doorway. She turned back to her screen. Her hands had a faint tremor that she noticed and then deliberately ignored. Outside her window, the city continued its indifferent operation. Traffic moving, buildings standing, money flowing through channels both visible and invisible. Somewhere in those channels, $11.8 million was sitting in an account, waiting to see whose name the story would ultimately carry. She was going to make sure it carried the right one. She pulled up the next layer of the archive and started to dig. At 7 that evening, as Nia was cross-referencing the third set of transfer records, her office door opened without a knock. She looked up. Vivian Ashcroft stood in the doorway. She was exactly as Nia had always observed her from a careful professional distance. Impeccably composed, expensively understated, with the bearing of a woman who had grown up understanding that power didn't announce itself with volume. She was 40 years old and looked it in the best possible sense, the way of women who had stopped trying to look like anything other than what they were. She was also the last person Nia had expected to see in this building today. Ms. Ashcroft. Nia kept her voice neutral. I wasn't aware you had an appointment. I don't. Vivian stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She looked around the office with a brief, comprehensive assessment, the kind that took in everything without appearing to look at anything specifically. I'm not here to see Damien. Then who are you here to see? Vivian looked at her directly. You. A pause. Sit down, Nia said. Vivian sat. She placed her bag on the floor beside the chair with the precise economy of movement that characterized everything she did, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at Nia with an expression that was not hostile and not warm, but was something in between those things. The expression of a woman who had decided to say something difficult and had arrived at the decision through a considerable amount of private cost. I know about the investigation, Vivian said. Nia said nothing. Not the details, but I know you found something serious. My father's network moves information faster than Damien's does, and the movement inside this building today was noticeable. Vivian paused. That's not why I came. Why did you come? Vivian was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands, then back at Nia, with the directness of someone who had decided that the conversation they were about to have deserved to be looked at straight. I came to tell you something that I have been deciding whether to tell you for approximately 6 months, she said. And I am telling you now, today, because I think if I wait any longer, the moment will pass and you will leave and I will have chosen the comfortable silence over the thing that was actually true, which is a choice I have made too many times and am trying to stop making. The office was very quiet. Down the hall, someone's phone rang twice and stopped. Damien doesn't love me, Vivian said. He never did. We both knew that. It was an arrangement and we entered it honestly. She paused, but I have watched that man for 2 years. I've watched him in rooms and at dinners and across tables in conversations that were professionally cordial and personally empty. And I have watched him when you walk into those rooms. She held Nia's gaze without flinching. He becomes a different person, not softer, not warmer exactly, just present, in a way he isn't present otherwise. Nia felt something move through her chest. She kept her face still. Miss Ashcroft, I'm not finished. Vivian's voice was gentle, but not soft. There was a difference, and she knew how to use it. I'm not here to play matchmaker or to transfer some kind of blessing I'm not in a position to give. I'm here because you are, from everything I have been able to observe, a woman of exceptional capability who is about to make a decision based on incomplete information. What information do you think I'm missing? The fact that powerful men don't chase what they love. Vivian picked up her bag, stood. They wait. They make themselves busy with strategy, and they tell themselves they're being rational, and they let the thing they actually want walk out the door because asking for it would require them to be something other than the person they've spent their whole life becoming. She looked at Nia one final time. Don't mistake his silence for indifference. And don't let the job be the reason you never find out what it could have been. She left. Nia sat in the silence for a long time after the door closed. Outside, the city had gone dark. The screen in front of her still showed the transfer records, $11.8 million, a frame built around her name, 48 hours until she could dismantle it completely. She thought about what Vivian had said. She thought about the plane ticket on her kitchen table. She thought about the look on Damien's face that morning when he had understood that Conrad Hale had tried to use her as a shield. She thought about 6 years of being the person in the room that no one fully looked at. And she thought about the fact that one person had, apparently, been looking the entire time and had not known what to do with what he saw, which made him dangerous in a completely different way than she had previously accounted for. She turned back to her screen. She had 47 hours left and 11.8 million reasons to finish what she'd started before she decided anything else at all. She pulled up the next document, found the thread she needed, and pulled it, and watched the entire architecture of Conrad Hale's carefully constructed theft begin, at last, to come apart at the seams, revealing beneath it something even darker than she had been prepared to find. The thing beneath the architecture was a name, not Conrad Hale's name. That would have been clean. That would have been the kind of discovery that resolved into a straight line. Find the man, expose the man, remove the man, close the wound. What Nia found at 11:19 on Wednesday night, 22 hours into her 48-hour window, was not a straight line. It was a second set of accounts, parallel to the first. Running on the same shell infrastructure but older, 18 months older, predating the Meridian Bridge construction by a full year and a half. Same transfer methodology, same layered subsidiary routing, same careful increment sizing designed to fall below automatic review thresholds. But these transfers didn't route to Meridian Bridge. They routed somewhere else entirely, through a different chain of intermediaries. And when Nia followed that chain through 4 layers of corporate registry documentation pulled from 3 different jurisdictions, she arrived at a number that made the 11.8 million look like a rounding error. $31 million. Moved across 18 months through an architecture so carefully constructed that it had survived every internal audit the organization had run in the past 2 years. Not because the auditors were incompetent, because whoever had designed this second system had known exactly what the auditors were looking for and had built the transfers to exist in the spaces between those searches. The account at the end of the chain was registered to a company called Dunmore Holdings. Nia spent 40 minutes trying to find the beneficial owner of Dunmore Holdings through standard registry channels and found nothing. A wall of nominee directors and registered agent addresses that told her precisely nothing about the human being who had built this. She changed her approach. She stopped looking at the destination and started looking at the design. The architecture of the second system was different from Conrad's in ways that were subtle but consistent. Conrad's construction was methodical and effective, but showed the fingerprints of a financial officer, someone who understood how money moved through institutional systems and had engineered his theft accordingly. The second architecture was something else. It showed an understanding not just of how money moved, but of how organizations thought about money, the assumptions they made, the categories they trusted, the invisible hierarchies of attention that meant certain accounts were scrutinized and certain accounts were overlooked. That was not a financial officer's knowledge. That was an organizational knowledge. The kind that came from standing at the center of an operation for a very long time and understanding, from direct observation, how every moving part related to every other. Nia sat with that for a long time. Then she pulled up the organizational chart and looked at it with fresh eyes. Not for Conrad Hale's position, for something else. For the position that would give someone complete organizational visibility without placing them in the direct line of financial oversight. The position that would allow a person to understand the full architecture of the operation while remaining functionally invisible. She found it in 40 seconds. Her own hands went cold. The position was hers. Not her specifically, not Nia Okoro, not the person currently sitting at this desk at midnight with cold coffee and legal pads covered in blue ink. But the role. Executive assistant to the principal. The person who managed information flow at the highest level, who coordinated between departments, who had sight lines into every operational layer without being accountable to any single one of them. There had been an executive assistant before Nia. Her name was Rachel Croft. She had held the role for 9 years before Nia was hired. She had departed, according to the HR file Nia pulled in the next 3 minutes, 18 months before Nia's arrival, voluntarily, according to the documentation, relocating for personal reasons to a city on the West Coast. The timing of Rachel Croft's departure aligned exactly with the beginning of the $31 million transfer sequence. Nia stared at the screen. Her coffee had been cold for 2 hours. The apartment was very quiet. The plane ticket was still on the corner of the table, still waiting, still 9 days away from a departure that felt, at this particular moment, like something from a different life. She had come looking for Conrad Hale's theft and found, underneath it, something that had been running for years before Conrad ever started stealing. Something that Conrad may not even know existed. Something that suggested the organization had been bleeding from 2 separate wounds simultaneously, one shallow and recent, one deep and old. She needed to make a decision. She could present Damien with what she had on Conrad, clean, documented, actionable, and say nothing about the second architecture until she had more. That was the contained approach, the one that solved the immediate problem without opening a larger question she wasn't equipped yet to fully answer, or she could tell him everything. Both systems. The incomplete picture on the second account, the Rachel Croft connection. The $31 million that had been sitting in the organization's blind spot for 18 months before anyone noticed there was a blind spot at all. She thought about what it would do to him. Not professionally. Professionally, he would handle it. He always handled it. That was the one thing about Damien Volkov that was never in question. She thought about what it would do to him personally. The specific weight of understanding that the organization he had built and protected and bled for had been systematically robbed for years by someone who had sat in the seat right next to his. She thought about the fact that the seat right next to his was currently occupied by her. She picked up her phone and called him. He picked up in 2 rings. "It's midnight. I know, I need you to come in tomorrow morning with enough time before Conrad arrives." She paused. "There's more than I thought." A silence. How much more? Enough that the 48-hour window might not be sufficient. Another silence. Longer. She heard him breathing. She heard underneath his breathing the particular quality of a man recalibrating. "I'll be there at 6, he said. She told him everything at 6:14 in the morning in her office with the door closed and the building empty around them. She laid it out in the same systematic, documented way she had laid out the Conrad material the day before. Account numbers, transfer sequences, the Dunmore Holdings wall, the Rachel Croft timeline. She put the organizational chart on the desk between them and showed him the position and the sight lines and what they meant. He sat across from her and listened without interrupting for 21 minutes.
When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. He was looking at the organizational chart. His hand was flat on the desk beside it, and she could see the tendons in the back of that hand and the way they were pulled slightly tighter than was natural. "Rachel Croft," he said. "Yes." "She left to be closer to family. That's what she told me. That's what the HR file says."
I attended her farewell dinner. His voice was very flat, the flatness of someone pressing down hard on something that wanted to move. 30 people? I gave a speech? Nia said nothing. $31 million. He said the number the way you said the number when you were still trying to make it real.
Over 18 months. That's the total I can document. There may be more in earlier transfers that used a different routing mechanism I haven't identified yet. He looked up from the chart. His eyes were the color of winter water, gray, deep, containing something that was not moving on the surface but was absolutely moving underneath. "You found this," he said. "Yes." "You found this because someone sent you an anonymous document about Conrad, which led you to the Meridian Bridge account, which led you to the second architecture." "Yes." "Someone sent you that document knowing it would lead you here." She had arrived at the same conclusion at approximately 3 in the morning. "It's possible, yes." "Which means someone knew about both systems and chose to surface the information through you, through a woman who was 9 days from leaving the country." He let that sit for a moment. "Someone who knew that if you found it, you'd be thorough enough to find all of it, and trusted enough by me to have it actually land." She met his eyes. "That's one interpretation. Is there another? Someone who only knew about Conrad and got lucky that I kept pulling the thread. Do you believe that?" She considered it honestly. "No, neither do I." He stood. The movement was abrupt, not agitated, but definitive. The movement of a man who had absorbed what he needed to absorb and was now in motion. He walked to the window. Her office window faced east, and the morning light was coming in flat and gray, the kind of light that made everything look like evidence. "Conrad moves today. Whatever I have on him, complete or not, I'm not letting him walk around this building with access to the financial systems for another 48 hours. If you move on him before, I know the risk." He turned. "Build me the tightest version of what you have on Conrad. Everything that's documented, nothing speculative. I want it in a form I can use in the next 3 hours." "And the second architecture?" "Keep working it, don't stop." His jaw was tight. "I want to know who Dunmore Holdings belongs to before the end of the week. That may require resources I don't have access to from open records. You'll have access to whatever you need. I'll make the calls." He moved toward the door, then stopped, turned back. He looked at her across the office, across the desk covered in legal pads and the organizational chart, and the cold coffee and the accumulated evidence of 40 hours of work she had done because she had decided the job in front of her was more important than the plane on Thursday. Nia. He said her name the way he'd said it in her apartment. Not Mr. Volkov to assistant, not employer to employee, just her name, in his voice, without the professional architecture around it. "I know," she said. She wasn't entirely sure what she was responding to. She thought maybe he wasn't entirely sure what he'd meant to say. They left it there, unfinished, sitting in the morning light between them. And he left, and she turned back to her screen and started building the case against Conrad Hale. Conrad arrived at 8:47 with his coffee and his silver hair and his 11 years of trusted authority, and by 9:15 he was sitting in the executive conference room on the 38th floor with the door closed, and Damian Volkov across the table from him, and 2 men positioned near the exits whose presence was not ambiguous. Nia knew this because Damian had told her. She was not in the room. She was at her desk, working the second architecture following the Dunmore Holdings thread through a set of private registry databases that Damian had unlocked with 3 phone calls at 7 in the morning. She could construct, from the sounds that reached her periodically down the hall, a partial picture of what was happening in that conference room. She heard, at 9:22, a voice raised sharply, not Damian's, and then silence. She heard, at 9:38, the sound of a chair moving. At 9:51, she heard nothing at all, which was somehow louder than the other sounds. She kept working. At 10:17, Marcus Webb appeared in her doorway. He looked like a man who had aged 4 years in the past 90 minutes. "It's bad," he said. "I know." "How much of it did you already know?" "Enough."
She didn't look up from her screen. Close the door, Marcus. He came in and closed the door. Conrad's been moved to a secondary location. Damien's got legal on the phone and 3 accountants coming in this afternoon to go through the full audit. He sat down without being invited. Is it just Conrad? She looked at him then. She measured the question, not its surface, but its weight. How much he knew, how much he was asking, how much he was afraid of the answer. Why are you asking me that? She said. Marcus pressed his mouth together. He was 52 years old and had worked for this organization for 16 years and had the specific look of a man who had seen enough that very little surprised him, and this was somehow still managing it. Because Conrad Hale is a lot of things, Marcus said carefully, but he is not an architect. He's a financial officer. He's good at moving money through existing channels. He is not good at building the channels. He paused. What I saw in the summary documentation this morning suggests someone built those channels. Someone who understood the organization from a different level than Conrad operates at. She held his gaze. What are you saying? I'm saying Conrad may not be the whole story. No, she said. He's not. The room was very quiet. Is it someone currently inside the organization? Marcus asked. I don't know yet. But you're close. Yes. He nodded slowly. He stood. At the door, he stopped and looked back at her. You know that whatever you find, whatever the full picture turns out to be, it's going to require you to be here when it surfaces, to stand behind it, to defend the documentation when people start questioning the source. I know. And you're still leaving Thursday. She looked at him. He looked back. The question behind the question hung in the air between them like smoke. I don't know what I'm doing Thursday, she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said in days. She found the Dunmore Holdings beneficial owner at 12:44 in the afternoon. It took her a combination of a Cayman Islands registry cross-reference, a Luxembourg corporate filing from 4 years earlier, and a single property record in the name of a trust that shared its registration agent with the Dunmore Holdings nominee director. The trust had a named protector, a formality, legally meaningless, rarely scrutinized. And the protector's name was in a document filed in a jurisdiction that required it for regulatory compliance, and that most people assumed no one ever actually read. The name was Thomas Volkov, Damien's brother. She sat with it. She sat with it for a long time, longer than she had sat with anything else in the past 42 hours, because the other discoveries had been shocking, but they had been about people she didn't trust, about a world operating according to its own ruthless logic. This was different. This was the specific, intimate devastation of a betrayal that wore a face she recognized. Thomas Volkov, 41 years old, the younger brother, the one who stood slightly behind Damien at public functions, the one who handled the Western network relationships, the one who had called the office twice the night all of this started, when Nia had told him Damien was in meetings. The one who had grown up in the same world as Damien, built from the same material, shaped by the same forces, and had apparently decided at some point in the preceding 2.5 years that the empire his brother controlled should be funding a parallel life somewhere that no one in that empire could see. She understood, in that moment, with a clarity that felt like cold water poured directly into her chest, why the anonymous message had come to her specifically. Why whoever had sent it had chosen the woman who was leaving, the woman whose departure would have made her the perfect fall for Conrad's theft, and who, if she stayed and dug, was the only person in the organization with both the access and the institutional knowledge to find what Conrad's smaller theft had been designed to obscure. Someone had needed her to find Thomas Volkov, and she had. She picked up her phone, put it down, picked it up again. She thought about what this information would do to Damien. Not the organization. The organization would survive this. Organizations like his had absorbed worse and kept moving. She thought about the specific human cost of a man who had spent his entire life believing that loyalty was the only currency that actually mattered, discovering that the one person he had never once questioned had been stealing from him for 2.5 years. She thought about whether she had any right to be the person who handed him that. She thought about the fact that she was the only person who could. She called him. I need you out of that conference room, she said when he picked up. Now, alone. I'm in the middle of... Damien.
Her voice broke through his in a way she had never permitted herself in 6 years of working for him. Sharp. Absolute. The voice of someone who had moved past every professional boundary they had maintained because the situation had moved past every boundary with them. Now, please. A silence. Brief. "Give me 2 minutes," he said. He came to her office. He closed the door. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there rearranged something in his expression because the composed executive architecture dropped several degrees before he had a chance to hold it in place. "Tell me," he said. She turned her laptop to face him. She watched him read the name. She watched him read it again. She watched his face do the thing she had been afraid of. Not collapse, not fracture, but go very still in a way that was completely different from his usual stillness. His usual stillness was controlled. This was the stillness of something that had been hit hard enough that it hadn't caught up to itself yet. He said nothing for a very long time. "Thomas," he said finally. Not a question, not disbelief, just the name, out loud, in the room, as if saying it was the beginning of making it real. "The documentation is solid," she said quietly. "The Dunmore Holdings connection is through a trust registration that, I believe you." His voice was very low. "I don't need the documentation explained." "Damien, how long?" "The earliest transfer I can trace is 30 months ago." 30 months. She watched him do the math, watched him go back through 30 months of interactions with his brother, dinners, conversations, the private language of siblings who had survived a particular kind of childhood together, and understand that all of it had been happening simultaneously with this. He turned away from the laptop. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her, one hand pressed against the glass, and she watched the line of his shoulders and the set of his spine and the specific quality of a man holding himself together through the application of enormous will. She said nothing. She had learned, over years, that some silences needed to be left entirely alone. After a long moment, he said without turning around, "Does anyone else know?" "No." "Marcus? He suspects there's a second layer. He doesn't know who." "Keep it that way." His hand slid down the glass slightly. "Until I decide how to move." "Of course." Another silence. She watched his reflection in the glass, pale, fragmented by the light, the distorted image of a man she had spent 6 years standing behind while he faced everything the world threw at him and refused to bend. He was bending now. Just slightly. Just enough that she could see it. "I need an hour," he said. "Don't go anywhere." "I'll be here." He left. She heard his footsteps going down the hall, not toward the conference room where Conrad Hale was being held, not toward his own office, but toward the elevator. She heard the elevator arrive. She heard the doors close. She sat in her office alone with $31 million and a brother's name and the understanding that the next hour was going to determine whether the empire Damien Volkov had built survived the week, and that when he came back through that door, she was going to be the person he faced first. She thought about the plane ticket, about Geneva, about the life she had been building in her imagination as an alternative to this one. She thought about Vivian Ashcroft saying, "Don't mistake his silence for indifference." She thought about 6 years of standing behind glass walls, watching a man she had decided not to want, because wanting him seemed like the most efficient way to destroy the only self she'd carefully built outside his shadow. Then she stopped thinking about all of it and opened a new document and started building the case against Thomas Volkov. Because when Damien came back through that door, he was going to need something solid to hold on to. And she was the only person in the world who could give it to him. And that, she understood with a quiet and devastating clarity, was not just a professional truth. It was the only truth that had ever mattered between them. The elevator down this hall arrived again. She heard the doors open. She heard the footsteps. She knew his footsteps the way you knew the sound of a door you'd opened 10,000 times, coming back toward her office. The door handle turned, and Damien Volkov walked back in with something in his eyes that she had never seen there before. Not in 6 years, not in 1,000 late nights and 100 crises in every difficult room they had navigated together. Something that was not strategy and not calculation, and was not the careful architecture of a man who had spent his entire life making sure he never needed anything he couldn't afford to lose. He looked at her and said her name, and in the single syllable of it was everything he had never once known how to say out loud. And she understood with the certainty of someone who had run out of walls to hide behind that whatever came through the door next, Conrad or Thomas, or both families burning and the organization collapsing into the ground beneath their feet, she was going to have to decide right now whether she was going to keep treating the most important thing as if it were invisible. She opened her mouth. She said, "Sit down." It was not what either of them had expected her to say. She could tell by the way something shifted in his face. The thing he'd walked in carrying, that raw, unguarded thing, recalibrating slightly in the presence of her steadiness. He sat. She turned her laptop back toward herself and closed the document she'd been building on Thomas and opened a new one and looked at him across the desk the way she had looked at him across 1,000 desks in 6 years, except that this time she wasn't going to pretend the desk was the point. "Before anything else happens," she said, "I need you to hear something." He waited. "Whatever you're about to do about Thomas, and I know you're about to do something, I can see it, so don't tell me you need more time to think. You cannot do it from the place you're in right now." She held his eyes. "You're in pain, real pain, not the managed kind. And when you're in that place, you make decisions that are fast and final and occasionally right, but occasionally catastrophic. And I have spent 6 years cleaning up the catastrophic ones, and I am telling you clearly, as the person who has seen both, this one requires you to be slower than you want to be." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're telling me to wait. I'm telling you to think before you move. There's a difference." "He stole $31 million from me, Nia. I know. He sat at my table. He was at my mother's funeral. He called me twice the night you found the first documents, which means he knew something was moving and was trying to—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "He was calling to find out how much I knew." "Probably, yes. And you want me to be slow. I want you to be smart. You're always smart. Right now you're also furious and devastated, and those two things together have historically not produced your best work." She leaned forward slightly. "The documentation on Thomas is solid, but it's not complete. I need 48 more hours to close it, to find the account where the money is currently sitting, and build a chain of evidence that has absolutely no ambiguity. If you move on him now, before that's done, his attorney will find the gaps and he will walk." The muscle in his jaw worked. She watched him take the logic apart, test it, find that it held. 48 hours, he said. "After that, you can do whatever you need to do. I'll stand behind every document." He looked at her for a long time. Then he exhaled, a long, controlled breath, the kind that costs something, and nodded once. "Tell me what you need," he said. She worked for the next 2 days with a focus so total and so consuming that she stopped experiencing time as a continuous thing and started experiencing it as a series of problems and their solutions. She slept 4 hours on Wednesday night on the small couch in her office, woke at 5 with her neck stiff and her mind already moving, and was back at her screen before the building's cleaning crew had finished the floor above her. Damien came in at 6 both mornings and stayed until midnight. He didn't hover. He didn't ask for updates she hadn't offered. He sat in his own office and managed the Conrad situation, legal teams, accountants, the careful internal messaging that kept the organization functional while one of its senior officers was being systematically dismantled. And twice a day he appeared in her doorway and asked a single question, which was always the same question. "What do you need?" She told him. He provided it. On Thursday morning at 9:47, she found the account where the money was sitting. Not Dunmore Holdings. That had been a staging vehicle. The final destination was a private account in a small bank in Valletta, Malta, held in the name of a Maltese citizen named Edouard Blanc, who, when she ran his identification number through 2 cross-reference databases, turned out to be a legal identity constructed 18 months ago from documentation that was exceptionally high quality and would have fooled most investigators. It did not fool Nia because she had spent 40 hours looking at the architecture of Thomas Volkov's financial thinking, and she knew by now how he built things. The specific aesthetic of his constructions, the way he favored one-step-removed nominee relationships and jurisdiction, hopped in a consistent pattern that moved clockwise through European regulatory frameworks. Edouard Blanc was Thomas Volkov. The account in Valletta held $31,240,000. She had everything. She built the final summary document in 3 hours, 27 pages. Every transfer, every shell, every nominee relationship, every cross-jurisdictional connection, documented and sourced and indexed with the precision of someone who understood that this document was going to be read by people who would be looking for reasons to question it and was going to survive that scrutiny completely. At 12:50, she printed it. At 12:54, she walked down the hall and knocked on Damien's door and went in and put it on his desk. He looked at the cover page. He looked at her. "It's done," she said. Thomas Volkov arrived at the building at 2 in the afternoon, summoned by a message from Damien that said, "Only need to discuss the Western contracts. My office. 2 o'clock. He came in the way he always came in, slightly behind schedule, slightly rumpled in the way of a man who used casual affect as a social strategy, with a coffee in his hand and a half-smile that had been charming people into comfortable inattention for 41 years. Nia was not in the room when it happened. Damien had asked her once, that morning, whether she wanted to be, and she had said no. This was not her confrontation to witness. She had given Damien every tool he needed. What he did with them was his. She sat at her desk and listened to the building. At 2:11, she heard a door close hard down the hall. Not slammed, closed with the specific controlled force of someone managing an impulse. At 2:24, she heard a voice raised in a register she didn't recognize, which meant it was Thomas's, because she knew Damien's voice in every register and he didn't raise it. At 2:31, she heard nothing. At 3:08, Damien appeared in her doorway. He looked like a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side. Not unburned, not undamaged, but upright. Still upright. His collar was open. He had aged in the past 72 hours in a way that was not about lines or gray hair, but about something behind the eyes. Some version of the world that was gone now, replaced by a version that was smaller and colder and more honest. "It's done," he said. "Thomas? He's being managed." A pause. "He'll leave the country. The money will be returned. Not all of it immediately, but there's an arrangement. It's the cleanest version of a situation that has no clean version." He looked at the wall slightly to the left of her face, the way people looked when they were talking about something they couldn't fully look at yet. He said he needed it. That's what he said. That the Western network paid into an empire he'd spent his whole life standing next to instead of building, and he needed something that was his. A short, humorless sound that was not quite a laugh. He's not entirely wrong about the dynamic. That doesn't make it less of a theft. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." He also said, Damien stopped, started again. He said he sent you the anonymous message. The room went very still. "Thomas," she said. He'd been trying to find a way out of the architecture for 8 months. It had grown past what he could quietly unwind. He knew Conrad's theft was going to surface eventually. Conrad was getting sloppy. And he knew that when it surfaced, there was a risk it would lead to the second system. He needed someone to find Conrad first. Someone with enough access and enough credibility to control what was found and when. Damien finally looked directly at her. He chose you because he knew you were leaving. He thought you'd find Conrad, surface it cleanly, and be gone before anyone started asking what else you'd looked at. He didn't account for you being thorough enough to find the second architecture. Or for me deciding to stay long enough to close it. Or for that. The silence between them was a different kind of silence than she was used to from this man. Not strategic, not architectural, just two people in a room on the other side of something enormous, trying to locate the ground. "Your brother used me," she said. Not with anger, just with the flat precision of naming a thing accurately. "Yes. And accidentally led me to everything you needed to know." "Yes." She looked at her desk, at the legal pads, the cold coffee, the 27-page document that had consumed the last 4 days of her life. At the edge of the desk, where the plane ticket was not, because the plane ticket was at home on her kitchen table, 9 days become 4 days, Thursday come and gone without her on a plane. "The flight left this morning," she said. "I know. I didn't reschedule it." "I know that too." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that quality of attention she had spent 6 years being watched by and had spent 6 years pretending not to notice. The particular, complete attention of a man who was looking at exactly what he meant to look at and not apologizing for it. "Geneva will have other positions," he said. "Probably." You could go next month or the month after. I could, or... He stopped. He pressed his mouth together for a moment, the slight tightening of a man choosing words with unusual care. Or you could tell me what it would actually take. Not to stay in this role, not to remain in this building in this capacity, but what it would take for you to be willing to be in the same city as me while you figure out what comes next. She studied him. Every year of knowing him was in that look. Every late night, every crisis, every moment she'd stood behind glass walls and watched him move through rooms like weather, and told herself that the distance was professional and necessary, and not in any way a form of self-protection. That's not the right question, she said. What's the right question? The right question is what you actually want, not what would be convenient, not what would keep the organization stable or fill the gap I'm leaving or solve any of the 17 practical problems that my departure creates. She stood up. She came around the desk until she was on the same side of it as him. No furniture between them, no professional distance, just the 6 feet of air that had always been the real border. What do you want, Damien? Not from your assistant. Not from someone who knows where the bodies are buried and can draft a contract in 40 minutes. From me, Nia, the actual person. He held her gaze. He didn't look away, and he didn't reach for composure, and he didn't retreat into strategy. You, he said. That's the whole answer. I want you to still be here when this is over, and I want the chance to be someone worth being chosen by. Those are the 2 things. He paused. I understand if the second one is a stretch. She was quiet for a moment. It's not a stretch, she said. It's a project. Something moved through his face, not a smile exactly, but the architecture of one, the suggestion of it, something warming in the winter water eyes. I can work with a project, he said. You'll have to be patient. I've waited 48 hours for a financial investigation. I can manage patience. That's not the same kind. No, he agreed. It's not. She left the organization on a Friday, 3 weeks later. Not urgently, not messily, not in the way of someone running from a burning building or sacrificing themselves to one. She left the way she had always intended to leave, with documentation, with a trained successor, with every piece of institutional knowledge she carried transferred into formats that would survive her absence. She spent those 3 weeks working with the same systematic precision she had brought to everything else. And on her last day, she sat across from her successor, a sharp, careful woman named Desta, who had the kind of stillness that suggested she would need approximately 6 months to surpass Nia's most efficient pace, and walked her through the last of it. The Marchetti account, Nia said, on that last afternoon. The arbitration clause. It will come up again in the spring renewal. Don't let legal tell you it's boilerplate. I won't. Desta was taking notes in a small leather notebook. Anything else? He doesn't eat lunch when he's in back-to-back meetings. Someone needs to put food in front of him, or he'll go until 7, running on coffee and the kind of stubbornness that thinks it's discipline. She paused. He won't ask for it. Just put it there. Desta looked up from her notebook. She looked at Nia with the particular perception of a woman who was smart enough to understand what she was being told and tactful enough not to say it out loud. Noted, she said. Nia packed the things on her desk into a single box. There were not many of them. She had never been someone who accumulated objects in professional spaces. A photograph of her mother, a small plant that had survived 3 years on a windowsill. The leather notebook she'd filled with 6 years of observations and cross-references, and the accumulated institutional knowledge of an empire that had run on her competence for longer than it would ever fully acknowledge. She left the notebook on the desk for Desta. She carried the photograph and the plant out through the lobby, past the front desk where the security guard said, "Have a good evening, Ms. Okoro," in the way he said it every evening, and she walked out into the late afternoon city and stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed the air that smelled like exhaust and cold pavement and the approaching dark. Free. That was the word. Not happy, not sad, not certain, but free in the way of something that has been held in one position for a long time and has finally been allowed to move. She flew home 10 days later, not Geneva. Home. The city she'd grown up in, 1,200 miles from Harwick, where her mother still lived in the house where Nia had learned to read, and her sister had 3 kids and a kitchen that was always too loud. She stayed for 3 weeks and slept in her childhood bedroom and let her mother feed her too much, and watched her nephews destroy each other over board games, and felt, slowly and with some difficulty, the particular sensation of remembering who she was when she wasn't being someone's indispensable infrastructure. She called Damien 4 times during those 3 weeks. The calls were not long. They were not romantic in any conventional sense. They were 2 people who had spent years talking about everything except themselves, trying, awkwardly, and with occasional false starts, to talk about themselves. He was a terrible conversationalist when the subject was feelings. She told him so, and he didn't disagree. She was better at it than he was, but had spent years suppressing the skill and was somewhat rusty. They were, she told him on the 3rd call, probably the 2 least emotionally fluent people she could imagine attempting this. "We're both very good at other things," he said. "That's a low bar." "It's a starting point." She was quiet for a moment. Outside her mother's window, her nephews were in the backyard doing something that involved a lot of running and the occasional shriek of competitive outrage. The ordinary noise of a life that had nothing to do with empires or shell companies or the particular exhaustion of holding someone else's world together. "I'm not coming back as your assistant," she said. "I know. I mean it. That's not a negotiating position." "I know that too." A pause. "I have a contact at a trade consultancy in Harwick, legitimate operation. They've been looking for a senior analyst with international experience. I didn't mention your name because that felt like overstepping, but if you wanted me to..." "You looked up jobs for me." "I looked up one job. I thought it was worth mentioning." She sat with that for a moment. This was, she understood, the closest thing to a romantic gesture that Damien Volkov was currently capable of producing. Not flowers, not declarations, but the careful, specific act of a man who paid attention to what someone actually needed and tried to provide it in a form they could use. It was not nothing. It was in fact a great deal more than nothing. "Send me the information," she said. "Already in your email." "You sent it before you mentioned it." "I was fairly confident you'd ask." "That's either very intuitive or very arrogant." "In my experience," he said, "those 2 things often look identical from the outside." She laughed. Actually laughed. A real one, short and surprised and slightly rueful. She heard something shift in his breathing on the other end of the line, and understood that he was marking the sound of it the way she had spent years marking the microgeography of his face. "I'll read it," she said. "I'm not making any commitments. I'm not asking for commitments. I'm asking for a conversation. When I'm back." "When you're back," he agreed. She came back on a Tuesday in November. The city looked the same. Indifferent, industrial, running on commerce that was only partially visible. But she moved through it differently than she had when she left. She had her own apartment still, the small place on Crestfield Avenue, and she went there first and unpacked and made coffee and stood at the window above the sink and looked at the city that had been the backdrop of 6 years of her life spent largely in service of someone else's ambitions. The plane ticket was still on the kitchen table. She picked it up, held it, felt the weight of it, the same few grams of paper, the same word one way printed at the top. She thought about the night Damien had stood in this apartment and looked at it, and looked at her and said, "I don't know," in the most honest voice she'd ever heard from him. She put it in the drawer beside the kitchen knives, not throwing it away, just putting it where it belonged, in the past, accessible, no longer on the table. She called him. "I'm back," she said. "I know," he said. "Your light's on." She went very still. "What?" "I can see your window from where I'm standing." She turned, looked out the window above the sink. The street below was dark and cold, November having arrived with its usual indifference. She looked for 3 seconds before she found him, standing on the opposite sidewalk, coat on, no gloves because he never wore gloves, looking up at her window with his phone against his ear. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass. He raised one hand, not a wave, just a hand raised toward her window, the simplest possible gesture of one person acknowledging another across a distance. "You're standing on my street," she said. "Yes." "In November, with no gloves." "The gloves were an oversight." "You have a car. You could have called from the car." "I could have," he agreed. "I didn't want to be in the car." She looked at him through the glass. He looked up at her. The city moved around him in its ordinary way. Cars, pedestrians, The indifferent machinery of a place that had never once concerned itself with what happened to the people operating inside it. "Come up," she said. "Are you sure?" She thought about 6 years. She thought about glass walls and professional distance and the 18 different ways she had talked herself out of wanting something that had been standing directly in front of her the entire time. She thought about what it cost to be invisible for long enough that you started to believe the invisibility was safety rather than loss. "I'm sure," she said. "Bring the cold in with you. I'll make coffee." She heard his footsteps begin to move on the other end of the line. She heard the sound of the building's street door, which stuck slightly in cold weather and required you to lift and pull simultaneously, a detail she had never mentioned to anyone, and which he figured out on his first try, which told her nothing except that he paid attention. He had always paid attention, she just hadn't always been willing to let that mean something. She put the kettle on. She heard him in the hallway. 4 flights, and she heard each one. She heard him reach her door and stop. She opened it before he knocked. He stood in her doorway in his coat, slightly out of breath from 4 flights of stairs, with the cold still on him and his hands empty and his face doing the thing it had done in this same doorway weeks ago. Stripped of strategy, stripped of the executive architecture, just the face of a man standing at the edge of something he couldn't control and had decided to step toward anyway. She looked at him for a moment. He looked at her. "You said something," she told him, "in this building on the last night we were both standing in it, that I didn't answer. I remember. You said you wanted me to still be here, and you wanted the chance to be someone worth being chosen by." "Yes." "I thought about that for 3 weeks. And?" She stepped back from the door. "Let him in." He came in and she closed the door behind him, and the apartment settled around them both the way it had before, warm and small and full of the evidence of a life she had built on her own terms. Books and photographs, and the corkboard with its postcards and handwritten notes. All of it still here. None of it rearranged to accommodate anyone else. "And," she said, "I think you were asking the wrong question. You don't need to become someone worth being chosen by. You need to decide whether you're willing to be seen as who you already are." She met his eyes. "That's different. Being worth it is a performance. Being seen is just—" She paused. "Honest." He stood in the middle of her small kitchen and looked at her with the winter water eyes that she had spent 6 years learning and would probably spend considerably longer understanding, and said nothing for a moment that stretched just long enough to mean something. "I'm not good at honest," he said, "in this particular context." "I know, neither am I." She turned to the kettle. "That's the project." He took his coat off, hung it on the hook beside the door. The hook she had never once shown him, which meant he'd noticed it the first time he was in this apartment, and filed it and used it now without asking, which was such a specific and characteristic thing that she almost smiled and managed not to. Almost. He sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at the empty corner where the plane ticket had been. He said nothing about it, which was the right choice, and she understood from his not saying anything about it that he had noticed it was gone, and had understood what that meant without requiring it to be explained. "The trade consultancy," she said, pouring water. "I read the job description." "And?" "It's a good position. You'd be good at it." "I'm good at most things I decide to do." She brought the cups to the table and sat across from him. "I haven't decided yet. I wanted to be back in the city first, see how it felt." "How does it feel?" She looked at him across the table. Across the 2 cups of coffee and the legal pad she hadn't put away yet and the space where a plane ticket had been. She looked at the man who had walked into her apartment 2 months ago looking for something he couldn't name and had, in the intervening weeks, lost a brother, dismantled a conspiracy, and apparently learned how to stand on a cold sidewalk without gloves waiting for a woman who had spent 6 years refusing to need him. "It feels like a beginning," she said, "which is terrifying." "Yes," he said. "It is. You're not going to tell me it'll be fine. I have no idea if it'll be fine." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. His hands were still cold from the street. She could see it in the way he held the cup, absorbing the warmth. "What I know is that every version of the future I've tried to map that doesn't have you in it is one I'm not interested in living in." The apartment was quiet. Outside, the city hummed its November hum, indifferent and ongoing. Somewhere in the building, a door closed. Somewhere below, a car moved through the wet street. Nia Okoro sat across from the most complicated human being she had ever known and felt something settle in her chest. Not resolution, not the clean satisfaction of a problem solved, but something older and more durable than that. The specific, quiet feeling of a person who has stopped pretending that something doesn't matter and started dealing with the fact that it does. One condition, she said. Name it. We go slow. Slow. No contracts. No arrangements, no strategy. She held his gaze. We go slow and we're honest, and when one of us is terrible at something, we say so instead of pretending. He was quiet for a moment. That last one is going to be a significant adjustment. For both of us. Yes. He looked at her. Agreed. She picked up her cup. He picked up his. Outside the window, November moved through the city in the dark, cold, and ongoing, and completely indifferent to the two people sitting in a small, warm kitchen on Crestfield Avenue deciding, without contracts or arrangements, or the safety of professional distance, to be visible to each other at last. On the last day of the year, 3 months later, Damian Volkov placed a key on her kitchen table. Not with a speech, not with ceremony. He set it down between the coffee cups on a Sunday morning when the apartment was full of winter light, and she looked at it and looked at him, and he said, I'm not asking you to move in. I'm asking you to know that the door is yours to open whenever you want it. She picked it up, held it, felt the weight of it, small, cold, a thing with no significance except what two people decided to give it. I'll think about it, she said. He nodded. He drank his coffee. She kept the key. She thought about it for exactly 1 day. On Monday morning, she called him and said, Woo, Tuesday. He said, I'll have your shelf cleared. And she said, I'll bring my own shelf. And that was the whole of it. Two people who had spent years hiding in plain sight finally choosing, without drama and without performance, to stop. The empire survived. It did what empires do. It adapted, restructured, absorbed its losses, and continued. Conrad Hale's theft was resolved through channels that didn't involve public exposure. Thomas Volkov disappeared into a quieter life somewhere he'd built with stolen money, and the complicated grief of a man who had confused want with need and paid the full price for the confusion. Vivian Ashcroft went on to negotiate the most significant Eastern Network realignment in a decade, on her own terms, without an alliance arranged for her convenience. She sent Nia a card at Christmas with no message written inside it, just her signature, which Nia understood perfectly and kept in the drawer beside the old plane ticket. Nia took the position at the trade consultancy in February. She was good at it. She had known she would be. And she was good at it on her own terms, building a professional identity that belonged to her rather than to the architecture of someone else's operation. She came home to Damian's apartment on Tuesdays and Thursdays and occasional Sundays, and she kept her place on Crestfield Avenue because it was hers, and she had decided that some things you kept not because you needed them as an exit strategy, but because they reminded you of who you were before you became part of something larger than yourself. Damian learned patience imperfectly and consistently. He learned to say I was wrong about that in a register other than a debriefing. He learned, on one cold March morning when she arrived at his door at 6:15 with a problem she needed to talk through and no agenda beyond needing to talk it through, that being needed in that way, without strategy, without transaction, just plainly and humanly needed, was not weakness the way he'd spent 44 years believing. It was, it turned out, the only kind of strength that had ever actually counted. He never said that out loud. He didn't have to. She already knew.